Thank you, Leila. Good evening. I'm Alex Gonzalez-Hormanov. I am the Latin America editor at Rest of World. Much like our panel's discussion today, Rest of World covers the effects of technology in the non-Western world. And today we've got a panel of pretty exceptional experts who will be talking about the challenges that we all face when it comes to non-English content and its moderation on social media platforms. Let me briefly introduce them. We've got Marwa Fatwa, MENA Policy Manager at Access Now. We've got Scott Hale, he's the Director of Research at MEDAN, and Dragan Nakaurin, who is the Executive Director and Founder of the Localization Lab. Let's throw it at them right now. I think what we'd like to hear to show the scope and the depth of this issue, because moderation sounds pretty bog standard, but I think people don't really understand what the real consequences can be. So let me throw to Marwa, who just a few days ago was talking about the dire consequences of mismoderation. Why don't you take it away, Marwa?
Thank you, Alex, and great to be here. I come from Palestine, which I'm sure everybody here knows. It's the most documented conflict in the world, probably also the longest. But since we are here in Europe and Ukraine has been heavily covered since the morning, imagine what would social media platforms do when Russia invaded Ukraine. Imagine if they shut down activist accounts, if they take down journalist content, every documentation of war crime and human rights abuses is systematically taken down. And then social media companies come out and say, sorry, it's a technical glitch. That's the reality of millions of people from Palestine, from Syria, Yemen, and many others who are living in the Middle East and North Africa region. Our experience is often described as people feel discriminated against, feel that the platforms are taking down their content without transparency. Just to give one example of what would that mean to a normal person. A few years ago, there was a construction worker, a Palestinian construction worker, working in an Israeli settlement near Jerusalem. And the guy posted a picture of himself with a cigarette in his hand and a cup of coffee in the other, leaning against a bulldozer. He is a construction worker, after all. He said in Arabic, in colloquial Arabic, "Good morning." An hour later, he was arrested by Israeli police and interrogated for hours until they realized that they made a mistake. Facebook's translation mistook or mistranslated his post from Arabic into from good morning to I want to attack them. Now, how would Facebook make such a mistake? Around that time, there were a number of incidents where someone driving a Caterpillar would drive into pedestrians. So you would probably think, okay, there is a male, a Palestinian male from a certain age in a certain location, and there is a Caterpillar. Now, of course, Facebook's translation services, it's like a black box. I know people who work on AI don't necessarily like that word, but it's really hard to audit or know how would you move from good morning to attack them. But what happened to that person? He was released after he was interrogated for a few hours, and trust me, you don't want to be interrogated by the Israeli police. And he shut down his Facebook account because he was afraid. That is one example of real-world harm that comes out of non-transparent and discriminatory content moderation policies. It's not an outlier, but it speaks to a wider pattern of discrimination, and I'm happy to dive into that later in the panel.
Transparency seems to be the ongoing, the refrain that we keep coming back to. And yet, I think most social media platforms would talk about themselves as having values. And yet, what do we mean by these values? They're global companies, they're used all over the world. But do they have global values? Maybe Dragana can speak more to that.
Thank you, Alejandro. That's quite a statement, global values. I think for most of these companies, they were created in the West, and so they're very much tailored, taking Facebook, for example, very much tailored for individualistic sort of Western expression. And so what we see is around the world, a lot of communities that use Facebook as a family or as a couple. They don't use them as an individual. And I think that's a very clear example of this wasn't designed for you. And there's very little effort by companies to make products that are designed for global users, that are adaptable, that are where users of different races and ethnicities and cultures who speak languages very different than English can see themselves in the technology, and that's what Localization Lab does. So it's not just language; it's also social constructs that are tied to this. It is the design. Design is very much political. It's changeable if you want it to be changed, right? But in this, very American Silicon Valley capitalist culture, it's designed to make a profit, and it's designed to make a profit from a North American and European, probably, audience most.
Can you give an example, a recent example of a platform that has not prioritized non-Western actors specifically recently?
Maybe not a platform, but we have worked with Signal before, and Signal app I know is going to be cutting down on certain languages like Hausa, which is spoken in Nigeria, and Pashto, which we worked on last year, in preparation of what was about to happen in Afghanistan, so that people would have an app to use for secure communication. But in a lot of cases, and Signal is not a company, it's a charity, right? So even in our sector, in public interest tech, we are not prioritized. I mean, look, we're speaking English here. I'm not sure if we're translating this conversation into other languages. And while this is a really cool group of people, are we having this conversation with this kind of power at this kind of scale elsewhere in the world?
Yeah, it's an important question to ask, right? It's an ongoing conversation, and we've seen the effects. You've both given us sort of sometimes dire effects, the terrible power imbalances that you've just mentioned. But we're also here for answers to an extent. So maybe Scott, our resident optimist, can give us some insight into what transparency actually looks like when it comes to moderation on social media platforms.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, I was told to play a bit of the role of the optimist, maybe because of my background more in technology. I'm at a nonprofit, Midan, that is building technology to assist fact checkers right across the globe. And I think we have been able to make some strides forward in terms of technology reaching out in additional languages, being able to group similar content, for instance, being able to detect repeats of similar claims that have already been debunked. But I think when you talk about transparency, Alex, part of the problem here is maybe you can have transparency in the policies, but then there's the implementation of the policies. And I think it's that implementation piece where we still need a lot more transparency. It's, the policy says one thing, but it's maybe acted upon in different ways. And so as an example of that, and I think this is probably well known at this point, but with some of the work that we've been doing as well, you can detect the same claim being repeated across multiple languages, and yet, that claim will probably be labeled or taken down in English far faster than it is in other languages, if they're acted upon at all in those other languages. And so I think it's, where we need that transparency is much more at the enforcement, interpretation of policy.
If I can add to that,
Please.
I don't think it's just, so it's not just the number of content moderators. We've been doing a review of social media platforms, I think YouTube, Facebook, and a number of other platforms of underrepresented languages, and we found that Google Translate was used for community guidelines. And then, so it's, like I mentioned earlier, it's not just language. When they're giving examples, there are references to ICE, which not relevant in Bangladesh, Myanmar, Ethiopia. It has a phone number for the hotline for Committee for Prevention of Violence Against Women and Children, also not applicable. There are policies on restricted goods and services like firearms. Other countries have very strict firearm laws that are not United States. So reviewers from Localization Lab have found it's not just how moderation is written. There's very little attention given to, again, who this is for, and how do we make this impactful for a global audience?
And it's a fundamental question you're asking, because ultimately underrepresented languages involve the most spoken languages in the world. Arabic is the third most spoken language in the world, and yet it is an underrepresented language. So the question is, how do we get the right people in the right rooms? What does proper content moderation look like? Not in terms of the tech, but in terms of the policy and the sorts of people who are there in the room making these policies, making the sort of decisions.
I think when we talk about content moderation of non-English languages, there are two aspects to that, in my opinion. One is we have to remember that these platforms, at the end of the day, are driven by growth and profit. So the decisions are made not based on what's best for the world or what's the ideal scenario or how to protect this marginalized person or to amplify marginalized voices, but where the market makes sense. Or when there's a threat of being held liable, or there's a threat of regulation, as is the case now in the EU. And therefore, a language like Arabic, which is not a minority language, it's, as you said, the third most spoken language on Facebook. It's one of the official global languages of the UN. And one would think that a country or a company like Meta has built its reputation on the Arab Spring, and the Arab revolutions, that these companies have democratized information, that they are a force for good. And Mark Zuckerberg's founding letter in 2012 came on the aftermath of the Arab Spring. And yet here we are. For the Arabic region, or the Arabic-speaking region, which is around 200 million users, we have only around, if I remember correctly, 600 moderators. There are two companies that moderate content. There's one in Germany, in Essen, from all places, and there's one in Morocco. Interesting enough, according to the Facebook papers leak, the company in Morocco had said, we understand all Arabic dialects, so no problem, we can do it. But they have incorrectly flagged Arabic posts 77% of the time as terrorist content, which means that for political language, for political dissent, and this is where people rely on those platforms the most, when you don't have access to mainstream media, when actually media is suppressed in authoritarian countries, this is your only space to share, to express your narrative, to document human rights abuses, and yet, when you are politically expressive on those platforms, you are being censored under those policies designed to fight terrorism. Which leads me to my second point. When you want to moderate content, you need to understand the language. And here comes the issue of interpretation. I disagree with Scott, sorry, Scott, that it's not only about the enforcement of the policies, it's also about the very design of the policies. A number of companies, we reference often Facebook mainly because it's the most popular platform in the region. There are policies that they could have been written by one of the regimes in the region, where certain political expressions are considered to be a praise of terrorism. It's devoid of political context, it's devoid of the local context and how people use languages to express themselves. As Dragana mentioned, it's a Western company that sees the world from a US-centric lens and sometimes has to comply with US regulations, and as a result of that, local languages and dialects and expressions, especially political ones, are censored. So in summary, it's about the design of the policies, which again is absolutely non-transparent, and how they're being applied. All is at the detriment of the grassroots activists, of the journalists, of the person who's trying to speak the truth or trying to use the platform in ways that clearly Mark Zuckerberg or others have not had in mind when they first started these companies.
So a big issue here is transparency, but also transparency in a sort of local, like a lack of transparency within a very localized Western position. A lot of what we do at Rest of World is exactly that, which is talk about local issues in a sort of lens that is understandable for these Western readers and how it affects them, right? So in Spanish, there's a lot of disinformation going on social media around vaccines, and that doesn't get moderated as much, and there's a sort of weird recycling system through which it ends up back on American media and social media because it wasn't moderated in Spanish, even though that's not a Western, American, US priority. So, Scott, what do you have to say about that?
Well, let me back up just one moment, because I will say I don't think we actually disagree on that. When Alex asked about, where is transparency needed, maybe I jumped onto the enforcement, because at least the policies are there, you can read them. But I absolutely agree the design process for those policies needs a lot more transparency. So thank you for pointing that out. And then I think maybe to make this point, I guess it's not just language, is it? It's cultural context in so many instances. So, what we've been able to do in terms of matching content and such, this is just the bare minimum that you'd want to be able to do, because, okay, it allows you to find that information that's being recycled, as you say, Alex, from one language to another. But there's a lot of content that is unique to each language and culture, and that's where we absolutely need those local perspectives to capture it. So, I think there's give and take here. In some ways, the recycling, and I can give lots of examples from this. Midan supports fact checkers in India, Brazil, the Philippines, and we've seen content just move across those regions as well as to the US. And in some ways, it brings attention to it when it gets recycled and brought into another language. And I think this is one pressure point that gets platforms or others to act, because all of a sudden it's on their doorstep. But I think we can do a lot better, right? We can identify that content a lot earlier if we actually had the infrastructure in place, if we had content moderators with local knowledge, culture, context.
What do you think, Dragana? You seem to be in agreement.
Well, we've worked together before with Midan, and what has worked really well is we've worked with real human people. We worked on a COVID-19 project where groups of people would be reading material to identify it as misinformation and write responses and have experts who respond to it. But it takes a lot of effort. It's a lot of work, and it's contextual. It's different, not just language by language, but it's different by culture, and it works. When you put that much effort into community, when you build that trust with them, that works really well. But I'll add something to what Marwa said. In case of, we're talking about language, we're talking about who is being left out of this. But if we remove this, from a platform, like Twitter or Facebook, there are a number of occasions where Black activists in the United States write about experiences of discrimination, of abuse, of violence, racialized violence, and their posts are taken down because some really vague description of community guidelines. Well, white supremacists will write just outright threats. And these will be left out, will be left up. It won't be taken down by moderators. So it's not just culture. There has to be willpower to make change there.
That's an interesting point you draw up. Do Western and American prejudices coded into the way these platforms are run and moderated, do those have knock-on effects outside of the US in the rest of the world?
Absolutely.
Do you have anything that comes to mind?
I mean, I gave a few examples of how, how communities that have been left out, that have just joined the internet a decade ago, that have kind of, internet has been more and more affordable, and also smartphones have been more and more affordable, so that what we see at Localization Lab is that people find their own ways to adapt. And we don't want people to adapt. We want them to be able to see themselves in the technologies that they use, to be able to trust technologies. We don't want to build distrust. But ideas like very binary ideas of race, of gender, that come from the West, these are encoded in when you're putting together a profile on social media. Are you male or female? It's only recently have been asking the question, we've been developing a culture to ask each other's pronouns to fight this. But meanwhile, that's been happening all over the world in different forms. We've just been kind of writing over that. And then, and I think on lines of race especially, it's extremely dangerous how, discrimination is pushed through technology and not audited at all.
Yeah. You said an interesting word there, and I'd like to go back to it, building. Before I throw to questions from the audience, I'd like to ask all of you, and I'd love to hear each one of your points. What can civil society, government, and the platform themselves do now that is the most impactful yet simplest thing they can do immediately? Let's start with Scott and go down the line.
There's so many things. Where to start?
Quick and easy. Give us something they can do today.
Yeah, I think this word on building actually is a really good word because it is around building that sense of, in building through communities. I think that would be it, actually. I would say building through communities, right? And so we have civil society organizations that know the local culture. They know the challenges. And one of the projects that I'm working on right now with National Science Foundation funding in the US, we're trying to shift this move from misinformation responses, sort of one claim at a time, which fact-checking organizations have done very well, but it's always reactive and it's always behind the curve, as it were, to addressing the broader narratives. And I think this is where community organizations just excel to such a great extent. They have their ear on the ground. They know about the long-running issues in these communities, and that those sorts of perspectives should absolutely inform the design of policy, the enforcement of policy, adjudication, straight on through, I think.
Marwa.
Oh, I have so much to share. I would say to companies, stop the pretense and get to action. I'm personally extremely frustrated that, as civil society, someone who advocates for digital rights, we are in close contacts with those companies. We hold regular meetings, but what comes out of these meetings is the most important. They know the issues. There is no shortage of coverage. There's no shortage of human rights experts, content moderation experts that can pinpoint what's exactly problematic in Mexico, in Palestine, in Myanmar. It's about willpower. It's a political decision first and foremost, and of course a financial one. So it's really time for companies to walk the talk and implement the policies they've publicly committed to. What is human rights, after all, when your users are being censored and you're being non-transparent about it? Or you're prioritizing certain regions because the perpetrator is a clear evil, and that's not necessarily the case with other places, and you assume neutrality. And for government, since we're here in Brussels and the EU has made quite a huge advancement with the Digital Services Act, try to always remember that whatever legislation that regulate those companies will have a spillover effect. It's much more global than you think. It goes beyond the European Union, and it will affect users around the world. And I think we are at a very interesting time where we can uphold human rights. If companies don't want to do it out of goodwill, then they might want to do it because they have to. And I think it's really important. So think global of those legislations.
Ragana.
Transparency would be the first one. We have a group of 7,000 people who are volunteers with Localization Lab. And when we can't make technologies available, we tell them we can't. I mean, that being accountable to users is the most important thing, and this is how we have trust of so many people. But with the companies, I think that applies. And the second thing would be to pay money to people who are, if we're asking for underrepresented indigenous people, minorities to flag content that is threatening them, their lives, if we're asking them to do free labor, we should pay them for that. We're taking their data, we're building a whole market based off of this data. I'm not a capitalist, so yeah, we should be paying people for their work.
And putting in safeguards to keep content moderators safe. This is difficult work, and if it's, even within properly paid content moderation, there are psychological harms that I think we can better address. And if we don't do it within formal content moderation, then it's falling to volunteer content moderation, where indeed many of those safeguards just aren't there.
I think we'd like to hear from the audience. Who's got any questions? I can keep chatting all day, but I think it's only right that you've made it all the way here to ask any questions. So, anyone? Over there, right at the back.
We were told there might be a mic running around. There it is.
Hello.
Yeah.
1, 2, yes. Hello, I'm Alex from EUT's Infolab. You thought about, you discussed about giving penalties to companies if they don't actually follow the book. So do you support sanctions against companies that would not follow their own policies? And what kind of sanctions do you foresee? Should these be financial sanctions, other type of sanctions? Do you see anything that could force companies to be more accountable on that? Thank you.
Take it away. Who wants to go?
I can go. You mean sanctions if the companies don't follow their own rules? Well, there are no sanctions. I mean, one of the problems, I would say, of content moderation today and why it is a failure on scale is because platforms enjoy a form of self-regulation. That's the form of governance we have now. And I think we need to move towards a system where there is regulation that centers human rights and the user, not government's interest in censoring speech, because that can also get out of hand. I mean, I come from a region where there is rising digital authoritarianism, and any government would be happy to take from the EU textbook and just apply it wherever, and then it's a completely different story. So I'm not an expert in EU laws, let's put it this way, but I think if we look at the GDPR as an example of sanctioning governments that don't comply with regulation, there might be an interesting piece to reflect on. But whatever the sanction system might look like, I think it's really important to end this era of self-regulation because it has not served users well.
I like the point that you touched there, which is, right, we're talking a lot about the platforms themselves. They can be sort of the villains of the story. But also, what are the alternatives, right? In Mexico, we had a conversation about a public option, Twitter, an equivalent, a Mexican government-run equivalent to Twitter. And people sort of took it with a laugh because no one took it seriously, didn't get deployed, obviously, but people thought, well, why on earth would we trust the Mexican state to be any better than these platforms? And so regulation is a massively important thing. But first, let's get to this question. What can platforms do to mitigate the possibility that their own policies can be weaponized in non-Western countries? I think that's a fascinating question. We've got issues with, they call them hostage-taking laws, where the platforms are forced to have an office in the country they're in, and that sort of puts people in harm's way, almost hostages, which is why it has the name, and that's the reason why they can sometimes excuse themselves from being, from regulating themselves, because they're playing the part of the sort of like subdued company within an authoritarian context. So what do you think? Okay.
Pass.
I can
Go for it.
I mean, Scott.
No, jump
Sorry.
in if you like.
Well, these kinds of laws, like data sovereignty laws, that require platforms to localize and have a local representative that would answerable to government requests of surveillance or censorship, and if they don't comply, well, they'll be sanctioned and throttled into basically oblivion. We've seen it in Turkey. There's a social media bill that was passed in 2020. Iran is also has a law on the table that would do exactly the same. And probably those kind of laws will go on the rise. Now, I know we've made platforms the villains, but sometimes they can be free speech heroes. Depends on where they are and the company. I mean, Twitter, for instance, has pushed really hard in India, where the government was also trying to have leverage or pressure the company to remove certain content, I believe was critical of Modi or something like that. So I think, yeah, platforms have a responsibility to push back. But of course, it's a difficult one to tackle, because what would you do as a platform when you're operating in a country where it tells you, well, give us this person's data or you'll be throttled? It's not an easy one to crack, for sure. And there's a responsibility for platforms to uphold their commitments whenever there is a threat or challenge. So, I mean, I wouldn't want to be in their shoes, let's put it this way, especially when you're operating in an authoritarian country. And sadly, when we talk about connected futures, I'll declare myself as the pessimist in the room. It's not going to be as connected as we wish to be if we don't really fight against these kind of laws that are popping up everywhere. So we have a collective responsibility as citizens, as residents of the world, wherever we are, to push and challenge governments when such proposals arise.
So maybe that's the missing piece, right? We've talked about the companies, we've talked about the governments. What about civil society, organized civil society? I know Scott's worked with activist groups and sort of tried to sort of square that circle that square. How does it work? What are the challenges? What sort of success stories do you have?
Yeah, I mean, almost to both of those questions that were on the screen previously, context is so important. How do you empower people to make their own decisions, understand what sort of content they can trust online? It's about giving them context from where it comes, what might be the bigger narratives into which something is fitting, where are those actors coming from. In the same way that we avoid sort of weaponization of policies that maybe are created for good reasons in democratic countries and then turned around and used by authoritative regimes to justify crackdowns in other ways. So fake news is a good term of this. Back in 2012, Midan was working to start fighting misinformation in the Egyptian presidential elections at that time. And, again, it was just sort of completely off the radar, but the whole idea of fake news being false or misleading has just been co-opted to mean news I disagree with broadly, right? And so I think it's so important that we have clear definitions by what do we mean. And say the IFCN, the International Fact-Checking Network, in this instance, sort of provide a good definition of, say, hey, these are standards by which we assess fact-checking organizations, for instance, and those then remove it from any individual government to decide, oh, I'm going to set up my own fact-checking initiative and, flag all the things I don't like, if I want to be involved, I should adhere to these standards set by an independent civil society organization in this case. And I think, those sorts of civil society partnerships, I think, are a real opportunity. Midan works hand in hand with civil society organizations, fact-checking organizations, to reach out directly to people, provide them opportunities to report content and, discover fact-checking resources.
Dragana, sort of fusing this question with a bit of the question on screen, what sort of best practices can you talk to us about when it comes to not only the platforms, but also civil society organizations? What can they do? What have they done? What have you done within the moderation context?
Yeah. If I may, I think you're leaving out a group here also. There are employees of these companies too, which I think over the past couple of years have played a really significant part in both leaking information, advocating inside companies. I don't know, I've never worked in one of these companies, so I don't know how this happens, but it is really inspiring, and it's great to see them working together with civil society groups. But to be more pessimistic than Marwa,
It's not a competition, guys.
I know. Here's the thing. When we're talking about connected futures, when we're leaving people out, it means certain people have access to more and more and more information. They're better connected, and others aren't. Where that rift is growing faster and faster and faster, the faster technologies that we have. So when we imagine connected futures, there's just so much work to do, and what we've been discussing today doesn't even scratch the surface.
So we've got 1 minute left. In 10 seconds, I'd love to hear from each of you. What would you like to be done immediately now? Just your quick 10-second conclusion.
Well, I'll say with the question on the screen, there's a lot of work that can be done better bridging academia and practice. And I think, this is an area I'm passionate about, multilingual natural language processing. So I think there's a lot that we can do there. Yeah.
Co-design policies with communities, talk with them, implement their recommendations. It's very simple.
Transparencies and what we mentioned earlier, and hiring more people, more actual people to be involved, and paying them fair, and fining the companies, and prohibiting lobbying.
Easy stuff. Well, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for DFR Lab, and we'll continue the conversation as we go forward. Thanks.